The story begins with Hi. This tale is drawn from a diary written by a man who ventured to California during that turbulent period. Through his words, we'll step into his world, experiencing the events as he recorded them, in his own voice. The names have been fictionalized to respect and protect the memories of all involved. Join us as we bring his story to life. In the mid-19th century, a young adventurer named Samuel Hargrove arrives in California, drawn by promises of gold and opportunity. Instead of wealth, he finds a land soaked in blood and betrayal. Haunted by his own conscience and a fateful encounter with a Native American woman named Ayanna, Samuel is thrust into a battle not for riches, but for justice and survival. The road into California was dust and dreams. Every crack of the wagon will seem to echo the promises that had driven me here: gold, land, a fresh start. The mountains loomed in the distance, but the valleys below were sunlit and green, as if painted by God himself. I came with little more than my rifle, a journal, and the kind of hope that only a man running from his past could carry. The first night, I camped near a river. The stars above were brighter than anything I'd seen back east, but their light wasn't enough to keep the shadows at bay. I was sharpening my knife when I heard it, a twig snapping, soft but deliberate. "Who's there?" I called, standing with my pistol drawn. The boy stepped out of the trees slowly, his hands raised. He couldn't have been older than 10. His dark eyes were wide with fear, and he didn't speak a word. Instead, he pointed. I followed his gaze to the ridge behind him. At first, I saw nothing. Then came the glint of firelight, the faint sound of drunken laughter. The boy tugged on my sleeve and motioned for me to follow. He led me to a small clearing where 6 people, men, women, and children, huddled together. Their faces were drawn and hollow, their clothes tattered. I didn't need to ask what they were running from. The terror in their eyes said enough. A woman stepped forward, her gaze as sharp as the edge of a blade. She held herself with a quiet strength, even as she shielded a child behind her. "Thank you," she said, her English halting but clear. "They follow us." "Who?" I asked, though I already knew. She didn't answer, but the sound of boots crunching through the underbrush did. The settlers came into view a moment later. 4 of them, armed with rifles and drunk on whiskey or bloodlust, or both. I stepped between them and the group. "Evening, gentlemen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The leader, a burly man with a scar down his face, sneered. "Out of the way, stranger. Them savages are ours." "They're just passing through," I replied. "No harm in letting them be." The man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You new here, huh? Let me teach you something about this land. Them ain't people. They're vermin. And vermin get exterminated." He raised his rifle, and instinct took over. My pistol was out before he could blink. "I wouldn't," I said, cocking the hammer. For a moment, it was just the 5 of us, the tension as sharp as a knife's edge. Then, with a muttered curse, the leader signaled his men to back down. "This ain't over," he spat before disappearing into the woods. When they were gone, the adrenaline left me shaky. I turned to the group behind me. The woman stepped forward again. "You risked for us." I shrugged, holstering my pistol. Couldn't just stand by. She studied me for a long moment before nodding. "Ayanna," she said, placing a hand on her chest. "Samuel," I replied. That was how it began. The night I stopped running from my past and started running towards something else. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the stillness of the forest. Ayanna and her people had settled into an uneasy rest, their backs to the trees, their eyes darting at every snap and rustle. The boy who had found me sat close to her, his head resting on her shoulder. She ran her fingers through his hair, her expression softer now, but still heavy with worry. I sat a little apart, cleaning my pistol. Not that it needed cleaning, it was more for my nerves. My heart still raced from the encounter with the settlers, and I kept glancing toward the woods, half expecting them to come back. "Why you here?" Ayanna's voice broke the silence. I looked up. She was watching me, her dark eyes sharp and curious. "Why does anyone come to California?" I said, forcing a smile. "Gold." Opportunity. A fresh start. She tilted her head, studying me like she was trying to read a book in a language she didn't quite understand. You're not like others. Don't be so sure, I said, my voice quieter now. I might disappoint you. She didn't smile, but something in her gaze softened. You help. That means something. The boy stirred and mumbled something in a language I didn't understand. Ayana hushed him gently, her words melodic and soothing. I couldn't help but wonder how many times she'd had to comfort him like this. How many nights they'd spent running, hiding, surviving. Who were they? I asked after a moment. She glanced toward the woods, her jaw tightening. Men who take. They come to our village. Burn it. Kill many. We run. Her words were simple, but the weight behind them was crushing. I felt a pit open in my stomach. Where will you go? I asked. She hesitated, then shook her head. No place safe. Not anymore. By dawn, we were on the move. Ayana insisted on leaving before the settlers could return, and I didn't argue. I wasn't sure why I stayed with them. I could have just gone my own way. But something about the way Ayana carried herself, the quiet strength in her eyes, made it impossible to walk away. We moved through the forest in silence, the boy clinging to Ayana's hand, the others following close behind. I kept to the rear, scanning the trees for any sign of trouble. After a few hours, we reached a small stream. Ayana knelt by the water, cupping her hands and bringing it to her lips. The boy did the same, though he splashed more than he drank. I watched them, feeling a strange mix of guilt and admiration. You can't keep running, I said finally. She looked up at me, her expression unreadable. What do you mean? I mean they're not going to stop. You said it yourself, there's no place safe. Not unless you make it safe. Her eyes narrowed. You think we fight? Against guns? Against many men? It's not just about fighting, I said. It's about surviving. Finding others like you. Building something stronger than they can destroy. She studied me for a long moment, then stood and walked closer, her gaze piercing. Why you care? These not your people. I didn't have an answer. At least, not one that made sense. Maybe it was guilt for all the things I'd done or hadn't done. Maybe it was the way her voice cracked when she spoke of her village. Or maybe it was just that for the first time in years, I felt like I was part of something that mattered. Because it's the right thing to do, I said finally. She stared at me, her expression softening just a little. Then she nodded. Maybe you stay. Help us. Maybe I will, I said, though I knew I already had. The days blurred together as we moved through the forest, always a step ahead of the settlers, or so we hoped. The more time I spent with Ayana and her people, the more I saw the weight she carried. She wasn't just protecting them, she was holding them together. One night, after we'd found a small hollow to camp in, I noticed her sitting apart from the others, staring into the flames. The boy, who I'd learned was named Nikin, was finally asleep, his head resting on an older man's lap. I hesitated before walking over. Mind some company? She glanced at me, then back at the fire. If you quiet. I sat down, leaving a respectful distance between us. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the flames and the distant rustle of leaves. You're good with him, I said finally, nodding toward Nikin. She smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. He lose his mother. She was my sister. I'm sorry, I said softly. Ayana didn't respond right away. She picked up a stick and stirred the embers, her face illuminated by the glow. She was strong, braver than me. I doubt that, I said before I could stop myself. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, the firelight made them look like molten gold. Why you say this? I shrugged. Because I've seen you. The way they look to you. Trust you. That doesn't happen unless you're strong. She held my gaze for a long moment, then looked away. Strength not enough. Strength don't bring them back. No, it doesn't, I said quietly. But it keeps the rest of you alive. That counts for something. She nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. What about you? You have family? I hesitated. The question hit harder than I expected. I did. Once. A wife and a daughter. They didn't make it. Her expression softened, the guarded walls around her slipping just a little. "I'm sorry." "Me too," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We sat there for a while, two people carrying the weight of lives lost. For the first time since I'd met her, Ayana didn't seem like someone holding the world on her shoulders. She seemed human, tired, grieving, and still fighting because she had no other choice. "Samuel," she said after a long silence. "Yeah, thank you for helping us." I looked at her, and for a moment, the forest and the fire and everything else seemed to fade away. "It's the least I can do." She smiled then, a small, fleeting thing, but it lit up her face in a way that took my breath away. The morning light was soft and pale as we broke camp, filtering through the towering pines like streaks of gold. Ayana was already awake, crouched by the stream, washing her face. I lingered for a moment, watching her. There was something in the way she carried herself, graceful yet unyielding, like the forest itself. "Are you coming?" Her voice broke through my thoughts, dry but not unkind. I cleared my throat and nodded, hoisting my pack. "Right behind you." The group moved quietly, each step deliberate to avoid leaving a trail. Ayana led the way, her movements swift and sure, while I stayed near the back, keeping watch. We didn't speak much during the day, but I caught her glancing back now and then, as if checking to make sure I was still there. That night, as the others slept, I found her sharpening a blade by the fire. She didn't look up as I approached, but she shifted slightly, leaving space for me to sit. "You're good at that," I said, nodding toward the knife. She raised an eyebrow. "You think I survived this long without knowing how to fight?" "No, I guess not," I said with a chuckle. "Still, it's impressive. I've seen grown men fumble with a blade, let alone use one." Her lips quirked into a faint smile. "Men like to think they're strong because they're big, but strength is here." She tapped her temple. "And here." She placed a hand over her chest. I nodded, understanding what she meant. "You've got plenty of both." For a moment, her expression softened, but then she shook her head. "You say this because you don't know me." "I know more than you think," I said gently. "I've seen how they look at you, how they trust you. That doesn't come easy." She fell silent, her gaze fixed on the fire. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "I don't feel strong. I feel tired, always tired." I didn't know what to say to that. Instead, I reached into my pack and pulled out a small wooden carving I'd been working on, a simple bird no bigger than my palm. "For you," I said, holding it out. She stared at it, then at me, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Why?" "Because even the strongest need a reminder of beauty now and then," I said, feeling a little foolish, but meaning every word. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing mine for the briefest moment. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. I nodded, leaning back and letting the silence stretch between us. It wasn't uncomfortable this time. It felt peaceful. The days ahead were grueling, the forest growing denser and the air heavier as we moved further into the wilderness. Ayana rarely spoke, her focus on keeping the group moving and out of sight. I followed her lead, finding a strange comfort in the rhythm of our journey. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the soft murmur of the wind through the trees. We stumbled upon the trail by accident, a narrow path winding through the woods. It was old, nearly overgrown, but it bore signs of use, broken branches, faint footprints. Ayana knelt by one of them, her fingers tracing the mark. "Someone else has been through here," I said, stepping closer. She nodded. "Not settlers. These are ours." "Yours?" "Our people," she explained, her voice quieter now. "Some still hide. Maybe they use this trail." Hope flickered in her eyes, so faint I almost missed it. It was the first time I'd seen her allow herself even a sliver of optimism. "We should follow it," I said. She hesitated, glancing back at the others. They were weary, their steps dragging. The forest had been kind to us, but the endless walking was taking its toll. Still, she nodded. We follow. Careful. The trail led us deeper into the forest, where the trees grew taller and the air cooler. Along the way, We found small signs, ashes from an old fire, a scrap of woven fabric caught on a branch. Each discovery seemed to lift the group's spirits, especially Ayana's. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the trail had widened into a small clearing. Ayana motioned for us to stop, her gaze scanning the area. "Someone was here," she said, her voice low. "What do you mean?" I asked. She pointed to the ground, where fresh footprints led away from the clearing. "We close. Maybe tomorrow we find them." The others murmured softly, their exhaustion briefly replaced by hope. Even I felt it, a sense that maybe, just maybe, we weren't alone in this fight. The next day, we followed the trail until it ended at a ridge overlooking a hidden valley. From our vantage point, we saw them, a small group of people gathered around a fire. Their clothing and movements were unmistakable. These were Ayana's people. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, she didn't move, her gaze fixed on the scene below. "Go," I said softly. She looked at me, something unspoken passing between us, before nodding. With a quick gesture, she led the group down the ridge. When the others below noticed us, there was a brief moment of tension. Ayana stepped forward, her hands raised, speaking rapidly in her language. Whatever she said seemed to work. Their expressions shifted from suspicion to relief. An older man stepped forward, his face weathered, but his posture proud. He embraced Ayana, and for the first time, I saw her smile, genuine and unguarded. I stayed back, letting her have her moment. This was her world, her people. I was just a man passing through. Or so I told myself. The camp was small, but bustling with life. A dozen people, maybe more, worked together in quiet harmony, tending to tasks that spoke of survival and resilience, repairing tools, drying meat, weaving blankets. Ayana moved among them like she belonged, her steps lighter now, her voice warmer. It was a side of her I hadn't seen before, and it tugged at something deep inside me. But as much as she seemed at ease, the shadows in her eyes hadn't vanished entirely. I lingered on the outskirts, helping where I could, but staying mindful of my place. Some of the people here watched me warily, their eyes filled with questions they didn't dare ask. I didn't blame them. A white man wandering into their sanctuary wasn't exactly cause for celebration. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ayana approached me. She carried a small bowl of stew, the steam curling upward like a lazy whisper. "For you," she said, handing it to me. "Thanks," I said, taking it gratefully. The stew was simple but hearty, and after days of dried rations, it tasted like a feast. "You don't eat much," I added, noticing her own portion was barely half of mine. She shrugged. "Others need more." I shook my head. "You need to take care of yourself, too. You can't help them if you're running on empty." Her lips quirked into a faint smile. "You sound like Elder. Wise beyond my years," I said with a grin. She chuckled softly, the sound surprising us both. It faded quickly, though, replaced by the same guarded expression she always wore. "They talk of you," she said, nodding toward the others. "Let me guess. They're not thrilled to have me here. They wonder why you stay, why you help." I looked at her, choosing my words carefully. Maybe because I've spent most of my life looking out for myself. And maybe it's time I did something that matters. Her gaze softened, and for a moment, the air between us felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. But then she nodded, her walls slipping back into place. "You matter already," she said quietly, before walking away. The next morning, the peace of the camp was shattered by a scout's hurried return. His face was pale, his breaths coming in short, panicked bursts. "Settlers," he said in Ayana's language, though his tone made the meaning clear enough. "Close." The camp erupted into a flurry of activity. People gathered what they could, preparing to flee. Ayana barked orders, her calm exterior hiding whatever fear she might have felt. "What's the plan?" I asked, stepping beside her. "We move," she said. "Find another place." "How far are they?" "Too close." The weight of her words settled over me. Running would keep them alive for now, but it wouldn't solve the larger problem. I thought of the settlers we'd encountered before, their faces twisted with hate. They wouldn't stop. Ayana, I said, lowering my voice. You can't keep running forever. She turned to me, her eyes narrowing. What you want? Fight them? D? I want you to have a chance, I said. A real one. We can lead them away, draw them off the trail while the others find safety. She hesitated, her jaw tightening. You risk much. For people not yours. These people aren't just yours anymore, I said firmly. They're ours. We're in this together. Her gaze lingered on mine, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of trust, fragile but real. Then we lead them away, she said. Together. The settlers came at dawn. We'd heard them long before we saw them. The crunch of boots on dry leaves, the occasional murmur of voices carried on the wind. Ayana and I had chosen a narrow pass a few miles from the camp to make our stand, where the trees grew thick and the ground sloped treacherously. Here, she whispered, crouched beside me behind a fallen log. They slow, easy to surprise. I nodded, gripping my pistol tightly. The plan was simple. Create enough chaos to make the settlers think the trail ended here, then slip away and regroup with the others. Simple didn't mean easy. Ayana held her bow, an arrow already nocked, her eyes scanning the woods. She didn't speak, her focus razor-sharp. The first settler appeared moments later, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He was young, barely more than a boy, his steps cautious but determined. Two more followed, older men with hardened faces. Now, I'm out. She shook her head, waiting. The group moved closer, their voices louder now. Track stop here, one of them said, his tone frustrated. Maybe they doubled back. Or maybe they're hiding, another growled. Fan out. Ayana's hand shot up, signaling me to hold. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, every second stretching like an eternity. When the men were close enough to see the glint of their weapons, she loosed her arrow. It struck the youngest one in the leg, and he went down with a cry. The others whipped around, their rifles swinging up, but I fired first, aiming for the dirt near their feet. Back off, I shouted, stepping into view. The older man sneered, his rifle aimed squarely at my chest. You're helping them? Traitor. I didn't flinch. Go home. There's no gold here, no land to take. You keep pushing, and you'll regret it. He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Big talk from one man. I'm not alone, I said. As if on cue, Ayana stepped into view, another arrow drawn. Her stance was steady, her eyes cold. The man hesitated, his grip tightening on his rifle. You really want to die for them? I want you to leave, I said. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, a sharp whistle cut through the air. Another arrow streaked from the shadows, grazing the man's arm. He cursed, dropping his rifle. Ayana's people had arrived. From the tree lean, more figures emerged, armed with bows and spears. The settlers, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, began to back away. This isn't over, the leader spat, clutching his wounded arm. No, Ayana said, her voice steady. It is. They retreated, dragging their injured comrade with them. Only when they were out of sight did I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Back at the camp, the mood was tense. Though the immediate threat was gone, everyone knew the settlers would regroup. Ayana stood apart, speaking in hushed tones with the elders. I stayed near the fire, tending to my pistol, and trying not to think too much about what came next. When she finally approached, her expression was unreadable. They will come back, she said. I know, but you were right, she admitted. We cannot run forever. Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken possibilities. What now? I asked. She glanced toward the others, her gaze lingering on the children playing near the fire. We prepare. For war. For survival, she said firmly. Together. The following days were a blur of activity. The camp, once a quiet refuge, transformed into a hive of preparation. Spears were sharpened, arrows fletched, and snares laid along the most likely paths the settlers might take. Everyone had a role, even the children, who collected stones and kindling for the fires. Ayana was everywhere at once, issuing instructions, solving disputes, and keeping spirits high. Her strength was undeniable, but I saw the toll it took on her. The moments she'd pause, her shoulders slumping when she thought no one was watching. "You should rest," I told her one evening as she inspected the barricades we'd built from fallen branches and rocks. She glanced at me, her expression unreadable. "No time. There's always time for rest," I insisted. "You're no good to anyone if you collapse." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. Instead, she sat down on a nearby log, her hands fidgeting with a strand of leather. "I wonder," she said after a long silence, "if this will be enough." I crouched beside her, picking up a stray stick and poking at the dirt. "It's not just about the traps or the weapons. It's about the people. Look around, they trust you. They'll fight for you. That's worth more than any wall or arrow." She looked at me then, her eyes searching mine. "And you? Why do you fight?" The question caught me off guard. I hesitated, the words sticking in my throat. "Because it feels right," I said finally. "Because someone has to." Her gaze lingered on me, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade away. Then she nodded, as if satisfied with my answer. "The settlers came at dawn, just as we'd feared. Their numbers were larger this time, their movements more coordinated. They didn't bother with stealth, their voices carrying through the forest as they approached." Ayanna stood at the center of the camp, her bow in hand. Her people were ready, weapons at the ready, their faces grim but determined. I stood beside her, my pistol loaded and my heart pounding. "They come," one of the scouts called, his voice tense. "Hold," Ayanna commanded, her voice steady. The first wave came quickly, 5 men rushing up the trail, rifles raised. They hit the first trap almost immediately, a snare snapping around one man's ankle and pulling him off his feet. Another stumbled into a pit weed covered with leaves, his scream echoing as he fell. The remaining 3 pressed on, firing wildly into the camp. Arrows flew in response, finding their marks with deadly precision. 2 of the men fell, clutching at their wounds. The last one turned and fled, his shouts carrying back to the rest of the settlers. "Fall back," Ayanna ordered. We retreated deeper into the camp, drawing them into the maze of traps and defenses we'd spent days preparing. The settlers, emboldened by their numbers, charged forward, but the forest seemed to fight against them. Nets dropped from the trees, tangling their rifles. Spears flew from the shadows, striking fear as much as flesh. By the time the battle ended, the settlers were retreating, their forces broken and scattered. The camp was quiet in the aftermath, the air heavy with smoke and the coppery tang of blood. Ayanna moved among the wounded, tending to injuries with a steady hand. "You did it," I said softly as she tied a bandage around a man's arm. "We did it," she corrected, her voice firm. I nodded, knowing she was right. This victory wasn't hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had stood and fought. But as I looked around at the tired faces and the hastily patched wounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. "What now?" I asked. Ayanna straightened, her gaze sweeping over the camp. "Now we heal, and we prepare. They will come again." Her words were a sobering reminder, but there was no fear in her voice, only determination. And as I stood beside her, I realized something. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was ours. The days that followed were uneasy. The settlers had been driven off, but their retreat didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a pause. Every rustle of the trees, every snap of a twig, had us on edge. The camp buzzed with quiet determination. Repairs were made to the barricades, more traps were set, and scouts were sent farther afield. Ayanna worked tirelessly, her calm presence a balm to the frightened and weary. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and crimson, I found her by the river. She stood ankle-deep in the water, her hands cupped as she splashed her face. "You should take a break," I said, stepping closer. She didn't turn, her gaze fixed on the rippling surface. "No time for rest." "You always say that." "Because it's true." I stepped beside her, the cool water lapping at my boots. "You're carrying the weight of this whole camp. You can let someone else hold it for a while." She glanced at me, her expression softening. "You mean you? If you'll let me." For a moment, she seemed to consider it. Then she sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. They look to me. If I stop, they worry. They look to you because you're strong, I said. But even the strongest need a moment to breathe. She shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. You're stubborn. Learn from the best. Her laughter was quiet but genuine. It was a rare sound, and I found myself wishing I could make her laugh more often. Later that night, a scout returned with grim news. They're gathering, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. More men. More guns. The elders convened immediately, their faces etched with worry. Ayanna sat at the center of the circle, her expression unreadable as the scout recounted what he'd seen. Wagons loaded with supplies, rifles stacked like firewood, and men, too many to count. They mean to finish us, one elder said grimly. Ayanna's jaw tightened. Then we must be ready. It's hopeless, another muttered. We can't fight them all. We don't have to fight them all, I interjected, stepping into the circle. We just have to outthink them. All eyes turned to me, some skeptical, others curious. Go on, Ayanna said. They're overconfident, I explained. They think we're a bunch of frightened people clinging to the woods. We can use that, draw them into traps, hit them where they're weak, then disappear before they can retaliate. You suggest we attack them? One elder asked, incredulous. Not directly, I said, but we can make them regret coming this far. If we hit their supplies, their morale will crumble. Ayanna nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. You speak sense, but it's dangerous. Survival usually is, I said. She met my eyes, and for a moment, the room seemed to fade away. Then she turned to the others. We fight smart. We fight together. Under the cover of darkness, a small group of us set out. Ayanna led the way, her steps silent as a shadow. I followed close behind, my pistol holstered but ready. The settlers' camp wasn't far, their fires visible through the trees. We stayed low, creeping closer until we could hear their voices, gruff and confident, their laughter grating against the silence of the forest. Ayanna signaled for us to spread out. Our target was their supply wagons, parked just outside the main camp. If we could destroy them, we'd force the settlers to retreat or weaken them enough for a decisive stand. I slipped toward one of the wagons, a torch in hand. The others did the same, moving with practiced precision. When the signal came, a soft bird call, I struck the torch against a flint and set the wagon ablaze. Flames roared to life, illuminating the settlers' camp in an instant. Shouts erupted as they scrambled to douse the fire, their rifles forgotten in the chaos. Ayanna fired an arrow, striking a barrel of gunpowder. The explosion rocked the camp, sending settlers diving for cover. Fall back, she called, her voice sharp and clear. We melted into the forest, the settlers' curses fading behind us. By the time they regrouped, we were long gone. The night raid bought us time, but only just. By morning, scouts reported that the settlers were enraged, their numbers swelling as they called on reinforcements from nearby towns. Their losses had only fueled their determination, and now they marched with purpose. The camp was quiet as we prepared for what we all knew was coming. Traps were reinforced, weapons sharpened, and everyone trained as best they could. Even the elders, who once hesitated to fight, now joined the efforts, their resolve hardening with every hour. Ayanna stood at the center of it all, a calm presence in the storm of fear and uncertainty. I approached her near the edge of the camp, where she was tying a bundle of arrows. She didn't look up as I spoke. They're coming, aren't they? I asked. Yes, she said simply. And you're ready? She paused, her hands stilling for a moment. Then she looked at me, her gaze steady. Are you? I nodded, though the knot in my stomach told a different story. I'll stand with you. Her lips curved into a faint smile. I know. We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the unspoken hanging between us. Then she turned back to her work, and I did the same. They came at dawn, as we'd known they would. The first sign was the distant sound of boots on the forest floor, followed by the crack of branches and the faint murmur of voices. Ayanna moved through the camp, her voice calm but firm as she gave orders. The defenders took their positions, hidden among the trees and behind barricades. I crouched near the front line, my pistol loaded and ready. The settlers emerged from the woods like a wave, their numbers staggering. Their leader, the same man who had taunted us before, stood at the forefront, his rifle raised. "Last chance," he shouted. "Lay down your weapons and come out. We'll spare your lives." Ayanna stepped forward, her bow in hand. "You lie," she said, her voice carrying across the clearing. The man's face twisted in anger. "So be it." The battle began with a single shot, the crack of a rifle splitting the air. The settlers charged, their weapons blazing, but the forest fought back. Traps sprang to life, dropping men into pits and entangling their feet. Arrows rained down from above, striking with deadly accuracy. I fired my pistol, the recoil jarring but familiar. Beside me, Ayanna loosed arrow after arrow, her movements fluid and precise. The settlers pushed forward despite their losses, their desperation driving them. For every man who fell, another seemed to take his place. "We can't hold them here," I shouted to Ayanna. She nodded, her eyes narrowing. "Fall back." We retreated deeper into the forest, drawing the settlers into the maze of traps and narrow paths we'd prepared. The air was thick with smoke and the cries of the wounded, the chaos almost overwhelming. Finally, the settlers' momentum began to falter. Their numbers thinned, their shouts growing less confident. When their leader fell, struck by one of Ayanna's arrows, the rest broke and ran, their spirits shattered. The camp was eerily quiet in the aftermath. The battle was won, but the cost was heavy. Many were wounded, and some had fallen. Ayanna stood at the edge of the clearing, her gaze distant as she surveyed the aftermath. I approached her, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on me. "It's over," I said softly. She nodded, but her expression didn't change. For now, her words carried the truth we both knew. The settlers might have been defeated, but the larger threat, the relentless push of those who wanted this land, remained. "What now?" I asked. She turned to me, her eyes filled with determination. "We rebuild, we grow stronger, and we keep fighting. Together." For the first time since the battle, a faint smile touched her lips. I returned it, feeling a flicker of hope amid the wreckage. This wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a new beginning. Months passed, and the forest began to heal, just as we did. The scars of the battle remained. Charred earth where fires had raged, broken trees from the settlers' wagons, but life persisted. Grass grew over the pits, and the songs of birds returned to the treetops. The camp, too, found its rhythm again. New faces arrived, drawn by the promise of safety and unity. Those who had fought and survived carried the memories with them, each scar a reminder of what we had endured together. Ayanna was tireless as ever, guiding the camp with the same quiet strength that had drawn me to her. But there were moments now, brief, stolen moments, where she allowed herself to rest, to laugh, to live. One such moment came as we stood by the river, the same place where we had spoken before the final battle. The water sparkled in the sunlight, and the air was warm with the scent of blooming wildflowers. "We've come far," I said, breaking the comfortable silence. Ayanna nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Farther than I thought we could. And yet," she turned to me, a faint smile on her lips. "And yet, there's still so much to do." I couldn't help but smile back. That's life, isn't it? One fight after another. "But not all fights are with weapons," she said, her voice soft. Her words lingered in the air, carrying a meaning deeper than the surface. I reached out, my hand brushing hers. She didn't pull away. "We'll face it together," I said, the certainty in my voice surprising even me. She looked at me then, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and something unspoken. "Yes," she said, "together." As the river flowed steadily beside us, I felt a quiet peace settle over me. The road ahead would be hard, but for the first time, I didn't face it alone. We were no longer just survivors. We were a community, a family forged in fire and hope. And together, we would build something lasting, something worth fighting for. Thank you for joining us on this journey through a forgotten chapter of California's history. Stories like these remind us of the importance of remembering the past, no matter how difficult it may be. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, don't forget to hit the like button and share it with others. And if you'd like to uncover more untold stories and explore the depths of history together, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Every week, we bring you compelling narratives that deserve to be heard. Until next time, remember, the story begins with Hi.